Hey guys, I'm back, and today's video is going to be following up the poll I put up on my channel, where I asked you guys which conspiracy theory video sounded best to you. The majority of you guys voted for the paradox theory, so in today's video I'm gonna tell you how and why I believe Professor Paradox created the Chronosapiens. First though, let's just briefly go over what the Chronosapiens are, and why I believe they were artificially created. The Chronosapiens are a race of beings that can control time in interesting ways. Going off of what we see in the show, it seems that Chronosapiens can freeze time, speed up time, reverse time, and show things that have already happened in one particular timeline. The astute Ben 10 viewer will probably already notice that these powers are remarkably similar to Professor Paradox's, which is what initially brought me to the idea that somehow Paradox and the Chronosapiens are linked. Along with having similar powers to Professor Paradox, it should be noted that the Chronosapiens seem very artificial and robotic. In fact, in one Ben 10 Omniverse episode, we see Upgrade actually use his abilities to upgrade a Chronosapien. The reason why this was important is because Upgrade's powers up till this point have only ever worked on technology, which implies that the Chronosapiens are some sort of living technology. Now, as I'm sure you've guessed by the title of this video, I believe Professor Paradox is the one that created this technology, and thus was responsible for the creation of the entire Chronosapien race. But why would Professor Paradox create the Chronosapiens, especially if he already has all of the Chronosapiens' powers? Well, in this video I've come up with 3 potential reasons as to why Paradox would need to create the Chronosapiens, and how he managed to do so. So without further ado, let's jump into the first reason why I believe Professor Paradox created the Chronosapiens, and how he was able to do that.
Traveling in time weakens the fabric of space.
If Paradox was ever erased from the timeline, the results would be disastrous, as Paradox has directly influenced numerous events in Ben 10's timeline, like the literal creation of Ben 10 himself by sending his younger self the Omnitrix. If for whatever reason this became undone due to Paradox being erased, then the world could have ended up being destroyed numerous times over by dozens of different villains. Who could possibly fix something like that if it were to happen? The answer is the Chronosapiens, who could likely use their powers to undo Paradox's erasure, much like how No Watch Ben used the power of clockwork to undo the erasure of all the Ben Tennysons. But if my theory is correct, wouldn't that mean that the Chronosapiens would be erased alongside Paradox? Maybe. However, I believe the Chronosapiens' powers would protect them from being erased from existence. Or if not, they could do something similar to what Professor Paradox did when all the Ben Tennysons got erased from existence. They could simply hide themselves in a pocket dimension and wait out the changes on time until they figure out a way to restore Paradox to existence. Again though, I truly don't believe they would be affected at all by Paradox being erased from the timeline, because I believe the technology Paradox used to create them would be able to protect them from changes to history. But again, that brings us to the question of how did Paradox manage to do this? Well, you see, I believe Paradox actually reverse engineered the Hands of Armageddon, a device that Eon used to cross over into Ben 10's dimension. Why do I think this? Well, Paradox himself seems to know an awful lot about the Hands of Armageddon, like how there's one in every single universe within the Ben 10 Omniverse. What if that's because Paradox himself had previously collected one of these things, and with the help of Azimuth was able to find a way to reverse engineer it in order to create the Chronosapien race, who would then act as a kind of guardian towards Paradox in case Eon ever tried to erase him from existence? I don't know, I just like the idea of Paradox using Eon's technology against him. It just seems really interesting to me. But if it doesn't sound that interesting to you, just wait till you hear my next idea as to why and how Paradox created the Chronosapiens.
Time travel is for immortals and fools, and I speak from experience.
You see, as I'm sure you've guessed by the title, I'm going to be talking about how the Chronosapiens protect the multiverse from itself. Now, I'm sure some of you are already scratching your heads, wondering what exactly I mean by that. See, despite what Omniverse would have you believe, the Ben 10 universe is filled with a lot more unique and unexpected things other than Ben Tennyson and his crew. In fact, the Ben 10 multiverse happens to have one of the most interesting superhero universes inside of it, and that universe belongs to none other than Generator Rex. In Generator Rex's universe, there are these things called nanites that can mutate human DNA and turn someone into an Evo, which are basically just straight up monsters. As you can imagine, if nanites started spreading throughout the multiverse, it could cause serious problems. Problems that even Professor Paradox would likely struggle to solve, as no one ever actually managed to find a cure to these things in Generator Rex. Only Rex himself was able to cure them, thanks to his powers. So Paradox might actually have to go grab samples of these things in order to figure out a cure, but that also runs the risk of Paradox becoming infected by a nanite. What if he ends up mutating into some sort of time-hopping Evo? That puts the entire multiverse at stake. So if Paradox can't go to that universe, who could? Well, as I'm sure you've guessed, the Chronosapiens are already living technology, so they wouldn't be affected by the nanites. And even if they were somehow affected, they could create a machine that could straight up erase any timeline that is infected with nanites, much like how the Chronosapien time bomb was used to erase all the bends in every single multiverse. This is how the Chronosapiens protect the multiverse from itself, by getting rid of timelines that could potentially create things that could endanger other universes, like say a timeline where nanites started spreading like crazy, or a universe where nanites infected someone who is able to time travel. And nanites are honestly on the lower tier of dangerous things that can destroy the multiverse. You see, in Secret Saturdays, we learned that there is actually an antimatter universe filled with an antimatter version of our main character Zack Saturday. Now, what happens when antimatter and regular matter mix? Well, let's allow VV Argos to demonstrate for us, shall we? Yeah, so imagine in the infinite multiverse, somehow one universe ended up with a matter and antimatter universe on the same plane of existence. Imagine the catastrophe that could result from that explosion, especially if it starts spilling out into other universes. I'm sure Professor Paradox knows what would happen, and that's why he created the Chronosapiens in response to something terrible like this happening, so that they could quickly analyze the situation and determine whether or not erasing that timeline would be the best course of action, and then quickly create a machine, most likely the Chronosapien time bomb, in order to do so. So hopefully I've thoroughly managed to explain how the multiverse is able to create threats to its very own existence. And if not, just remember that these things that I just mentioned, while they're still pretty dangerous, are nowhere near as dangerous as things like the Niall in the Ben 10 universe, which can literally destroy an entire universe. But now I want to explain how Paradox created the Chronosapiens. You see, I believe Paradox is using the meta nanites from Generator Rex in order to create the Chronosapiens. But what exactly is a meta nanite? Well, according to the show, it's basically a nanite that controls an aspect of the universe, like matter and antimatter. In order to build the Chronosapiens, I believe Paradox mass manufactures the meta nanite that allows you to control time and space, which would explain how the Chronosapiens get their unique powers. There is one small problem with this theory, and that is that Generator Rex flat out states that you need a master control nanite to be able to use a meta nanite. However, this doesn't necessarily completely negate this theory, as in Generator Rex, we see one of the Consortium, a group of people dedicated to figuring out how to control the meta nanites, gain power over time, even though they didn't possess a master control nanite. So with a little bit of tinkering, I believe Professor Paradox could figure out a way to circumvent the need for a master control nanite. However, in truth, I believe Professor Paradox doesn't actually need to tinker with the meta nanite at all. You see, I believe Professor Paradox already knows someone who can help him with the nanite problem he's having, someone who is intimately familiar with the nanites, and who has traveled through time themselves. Who is this mysterious person I'm talking about? Cesar Salazar. For those of you that don't remember, Cesar Salazar is Rex Salazar's brother, who accidentally got sent 5 years into the future after the nanite event, a huge explosion, threw his ship off course and sent it hurling through space. I believe this caught Paradox's attention, and when he realized Cesar could help him with a project he was working on, that project being the Chronosapiens, he decided to go down and ask him for some help. Now I'm sure some of you are asking, why would Paradox ask for help? After all, you yourself pointed out that he's a great scientist scientist. While true, Paradox is very intelligent, I don't think that he would be able to figure out the nanite problem on his own, as the nanites are highly complicated machines, and the meta-nanites are a little dangerous to tamper with on your own. Plus, why wouldn't he use Caesar? Remember, Paradox isn't above speaking to normal people, he talks to Azimuth all the time, so why wouldn't he be interested in approaching a fellow scientist, especially if he needed help with something that scientist in particular is an expert in. Plus, Caesar knowing Paradox might help explain some things we learn about him in the Heroes United crossover, like for instance how Caesar had a null void projector, which is a very strange thing to have in Generator X's universe, as parallel worlds have yet to be proven real, as stated by Dr. Holiday. So if Caesar had this, why not show it off to the scientific community and help further the knowledge of other universes to them? Perhaps because the person that gave it to him warned him never to do this, lest his timeline become polluted with technology it shouldn't have. This might even explain the real reason why Caesar built Alpha. Alpha was meant to be an early prototype of a Chronosapien that sadly went rogue and had to be trapped in the null void lest it cause any damage to the timeline he was in. But I can already hear you guys in the comments telling me that there's no way that Paradox would ever do something like this. Interacting with Caesar, even if it is in the past or even far into the future, could potentially affect his timeline. Heck, even Paradox being there could end with him being infected by nanites like I mentioned earlier, so it would simply be too risky. Okay, fair point, but what if Paradox worked with someone from the Generator X universe that has A, already left that universe for the foreseeable future, and B, has already meddled with space-time and violated its laws and restrictions, making it so that interacting with them further wouldn't cause nearly as much damage as what they had already done? Would Paradox even be open to working with someone like that? Well, I believe he would be, if they could help him unlock the time meta-nanite and use its power to create the Chronosapien race. But is there anyone in the Generator X universe who fits all the criteria I just mentioned? Well, as I'm sure some diehard Generator X fans have already figured out, there is one character who fits all the criteria I just mentioned, and that character is none other than the main villain of Generator X, Van Cleis. Van Cleis has a lot of the same attributes that Caesar does. He too is a famous scientist that worked on the Nanite project, and is probably one of the only people left in the Generator X universe that could figure out a way to get a meta-nanite working without needing a master control nanite. And since his role in Generator X's story is pretty much finished, and he's basically been sent out of his own universe by Breach, Paradox wouldn't be breaking any laws of time by using Van Cleis to create the Chronosapiens. And even if he was, so what? Van Cleis has already messed up his own timeline by traveling back in time, so there's really nothing left for Paradox to mess up. And again, he's already left the Generator X timeline currently, so really there's not much of a risk to Paradox interacting with Van Cleis, at least not as much as there would be if he interacted with Caesar instead. But now I'm sure Van Cleis fans are wondering, hey 810, couldn't Van Cleis just betray Paradox and gain his powers or something? Listen, I was gonna have a section here about that, but come on. Van Cleis tricking Paradox is just not gonna happen. Paradox is 1, too smart for that, and 2, way too powerful for Van Cleis to beat. Even assuming that he gets some time powers of his own from those meta-nanites, he would still have a long way to go before being able to compete with Professor Paradox, a guy who even Celestial Sapiens are afraid of. Plus, if Van Cleis ever tries to betray Paradox, he could just threaten him by being like, hey, you don't help me, you go back to your own dimension, where Rex can just easily cure you of your powers and where you'll be easily arrested. Or he sends him back to Breach in her dimension, where she can pretty much keep him as a plaything for all eternity. Either way, the options for Van Cleis are looking a little limited here, so I feel like he would be willing to help Paradox. And who knows, maybe he'll see it as a form of redemption, finally getting a chance to make up for all the crimes he's committed as a crazy Evo. Or maybe he will try and betray Paradox and get sent back anyway. Either way though, I think Paradox will be able to keep Van Cleis around long enough for him to complete his work on unlocking the meta-nanite for him, thus allowing Paradox to create the Chronosapiens. So yeah, now that I'm done ranting about how Paradox created the Chronosapiens, let's move on to my last possible reason as to why Paradox created the Chronosapiens, and how he did that.
Maltruant is stuck in a time loop.
And he is doomed to failure over and over. Every time he pulls himself together, he returns to the beginning of time and is defeated by Ben. I gather up the pieces of Maltruant and scatter them across the universe, and the loop begins again.
Alright, so this reason as to why Paradox created the Chronosapiens is honestly one of my personal favorites. You see, as I'm sure you've noticed, I really like the idea of Paradox using the villain's technology against them in order to protect the universe from them. This reason is the ultimate version of that idea. You see, in this section, I'm going to posit the idea that Paradox actually created the Chronosapiens by reverse engineering the parts of Maltruant given to him by Ben Tennyson at the end of Ben 10 Omniverse. But why would Paradox reverse engineer parts of Maltruant in order to create the Chronosapiens? Why are the Chronosapiens so important? Well, you see, that's why this theory is one of my personal favorites, because I believe the Chronosapiens themselves aren't what's important here, but rather, it's Maltruant himself who is so important. You see, I believe Paradox created the whole Chronosapien race so that one day Maltruant could be born. But why would Paradox do this? After all, Maltruant is one of the few villains in Ben 10 that could possibly hurt Paradox and has caused untold damage to the time stream. Well, you see, dear viewer, I believe this all plays into that time loop that Ben 10 Omniverse talked about. I believe that Maltruant becoming trapped in this time loop is extremely important for a number of different reasons. One is the fact that it definitively traps Maltruant within a section of time, which basically means that Maltruant is in jail, a jail he can never actually escape from. This also brings me to my second and much more important reason, is that by trapping Maltruant in this jail, Paradox also definitively locks in Ben's canonical future, Ben 10K, that is, Omniverse's version of Ben 10,000. We know this is the case because Ben 10K had memories of what our Ben was doing in the present day timeline. Now, this is extremely significant because usually what happens when a Ben 10,000 meets a younger version of themselves is that they never actually remember that happening, because the second they interact with their younger self, they change time and forever alter their future, which basically means they stop existing. However, this version of Ben 10,000, as I'm sure you've guessed, didn't do that. He actually remembered being the younger Ben, and when they interacted, we still saw him again later on in a future Ben 10,000 episode in Omniverse, meaning that Ben's future did not change when he interacted with it, and I believe the reason for that is because of this time loop that Paradox set up with Maltruant. You see, I believe for whatever reason, Paradox needed that specific version of Ben 10,000, whether that be because that Ben 10,000 was extremely important to him, or just because he was one of the few Ben 10,000s that had the Bi-Omnitrix, perhaps due to the fact that losing Skurd inspired him to create it, which only happens if Maltruant gets stuck in that time loop in that specific moment, because that's when Skurd interacts with his masters, the Contumalia, who explain what he really is, which motivates him to leave Ben 10 and rejoin his race. Or maybe this version of Ben 10,000 did something super important in that Time War arc that we never actually got to see on screen in Omniverse, that was just offhandedly referenced by Ben 10K when he first interacted with his past self. This super important event might have been a key moment in time that Paradox wanted to ensure happened, so he went out of his way to create Maltruant and his whole race to ensure that this version of Ben 10K would get locked in as Ben's default future in order to do the super important thing in the Time War. So basically, to sum up, Paradox went out of his way to ensure Maltruant's existence by creating his whole race, the Chronosapiens, so that he could in turn become trapped in a time loop that would then lock in Ben's canonical future of Ben 10K. And for those of you still not convinced by this theory, just remember that this has all already happened, because these events take place during the beginning of Ben's universe. So if these things don't happen in this specific order, it could cause a time paradox, which is something Professor Paradox simply does not abide by. Remember, his whole thing is protecting the timeline. So technically, by doing all this, he's protecting the timeline from if he didn't do any of all this. Hope that made sense, because I'm going to wrap up the video here, guys. Sorry this took so long, and sorry this was such a long video. I really hate uploading 2 long videos in a row, but there was just too much meat here, for lack of a better word, to cut out. Hopefully my next video will be shorter. If you're new around here, please remember to like and subscribe, and share the video with anyone you might know, as it greatly helps me out. I hope to see you all in my next video upload, but for now, bye!